Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about application passwords. If you were at our meetup last month, you saw we did one of our 5.6 overviews. We touched on application passwords a little bit, but I'm going to dive into it a little bit more this time. Okay, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the history of application passwords and the REST API and authentication stuff. Starting in WordPress 3.5, XML RPC has been in WordPress for a long time, but starting in WordPress 3.5, the UI option for it was removed and it was enabled by default for everyone. And XML RPC used just your basic username and your password. What this meant was that it was really easy to integrate with. Anyone who wanted to use XML RPC would just have to ask you for your username and your password, and then they could connect to your account. Later, in WordPress 4.7, the REST API content endpoints were introduced. But at this point, the REST API only had one form of authentication built into it, and it's the authentication that you basically use when you're logging into WordPress already. So what this meant was that if someone wanted to use the REST API themselves, they would have to use one of the many official or unofficial REST API auth plugins. There are plugins for OAuth 1 and OAuth 2. There were a number of different plugins that use JWTs. And there is the application passwords feature plugin itself, which is the precursor to the applications passwords feature in WordPress 5.6. And what happened a lot of the time was that plugins would end up developing their own. So pretty much every large plugin that had a REST API integration of some kind, a REST API endpoints like WooCommerce and Affiliate WP and all these LMS plugins and everything, they would all end up developing their own authentication mechanism that would be specific to them, because if you wanted to use the REST API, you needed some form of authentication. And there wasn't really a way to do that in WordPress core. So when we were thinking about designing a REST API authentication mechanism for WordPress core, we had a couple of requirements in mind. First, it had to be secure. This is obvious. We don't want to introduce something that would make everyone's WordPress sites insecure and would lead them to disable it. It also had to be an interactive authentication solution. One of the tricky bits with XML RPC was that since it just accepted your username and your password, it was really easy for it to be used as a way for attackers to brute force into your WordPress website, because they could just try username and password and username and password and password and password over and over again. And because it wasn't an interactive authentication solution, and what I mean by that is you didn't go, for instance, to wplogin.php, see your username field, see your text field, it meant that you couldn't provide things like reCAPTCHA or ways to handle lockouts or two-factor. None of those would work with XML RPC authentication. They would just have to be disabled, and then you're kind of back to the square one of just getting your site pummeled by attacks. We wanted to make sure that it was revocable. So what you don't want to have with this situation is, let's say you're using this app, and maybe that app gets compromised, or that app, you're no longer using it anymore. You want to be able to take away the credentials for that application without having to completely change your username and password. So you should be able to just simply revoke an application and revoke its rights to work. And lastly, it had to be a decentralized solution. So we couldn't have one of the possible ideas was that WordPress.org would have a directory of all the different applications, and they would have to register themselves there, and WordPress.org would go through approving them and all of that. That was a requirement that we couldn't have. WordPress.org wasn't able to take on that responsibility. So one of the solutions that we wound up with, and what wound up in core, is application passwords. And so what application passwords are is it's a password that is generated for every single application that you want to communicate with. They can't be used when you want to log in. So if you tried to take your username and password and use an application password on WP login, it wouldn't work. It's not really brute forceable. The password that is generated is random, and it's not something that the user can set. People are really bad about generating strong passwords themselves, but what is great about this is we just generate it for them, so it's something that's really unfeasible to brute force. And it uses basic authentication, which is a really simple API authentication solution that pretty much all clients and libraries have support for out of the box. So it's really simple as a developer to get started with it. Lastly, it also comes with a profile UI for Lastly, it comes with a profile UI for authentication. So for managing the authenticated apps, you can revoke them and see details about them. And it has an authorized application UI. And so this is how it handles the interactive parts. So here's an example of that profile UI. You can see here I'm on my WordPress profile. I can see the different apps that I've connected to my account. I can see when they were last used, their IP address, and if I want, I can revoke them just by clicking that button there. So what are some use cases that you can use app passwords for, or really the REST API on authentication for? I think there are a lot of different cool ones, but here are some that come to mind and things that I've been working on. Importing and exporting. This is actually something that I'm working on developing right now at iThemes for one of our plugins. But if you have a plugin that you install on 10, 20, 30 different sites, you might have a configuration, let's say, that you want to import into every single site. And it would be really cool if you could just type in the URL of your website, and then it could go fetch it. Obviously, to make it secure, you need to put some kind of authentication behind that. And App Passwords makes a really convenient way to do that. They can just type in their website, you can bring them over to Authenticate, and you're back in. And it'll work for pretty much every website. Desktop publishing is a great example of this. For instance, you might have heard of MarsEdit, and there are lots of others, I think Ulysses and Blogo, that allow you to write in a kind of rich text editor on your computer. But if you want, you can publish directly to your WordPress website without leaving your desktop. And so this is a great case for using the REST API. The WordPress mobile app is a really big one and probably the biggest motivator for this feature landing in WordPress core. As the WordPress editor relies more and more on Gutenberg, the WordPress mobile app needs a way to connect to the REST API. And so this is a huge use case for it and can be used by anyone else who wants to make a mobile app. I think this is also helpful for third-party services, things like Zapier or If This Then That. Zapier, for instance, right now, they make you install a REST API plugin that all it does is provide an authentication mechanism so that Zapier can connect to your website. They're able to do everything they need to do over the REST API, but without that authentication mechanism, they were forced to build a plugin that you need to install. And I think there are also probably some cool things that you could do here for helping users set up plugins. So for instance, one of the cool things that landed in WordPress 5.5 was the ability to install any plugin that's available in WordPress.org over the REST API. And so I think there are probably some interesting things you could do here with helping users get started on your plugin from your website. So for instance, you could go to like Yoast.com. You could say, oh, I want to set up Yoast and type in your website. And then Yoast could handle authenticating and setting up and installing the plugin and doing all that kind of work for you without you have to figuring out how to go to WordPress plugins and add new and searching and things like that. So I think that's something that'd be pretty interesting to take a look at. Before we get too much further, I wanted to show you a couple of demos of what this feature looks like in action. So this is one of our products here, and you can see how simple the authentication process is. All I need to do is type in my website. I get redirected to my website and just need to click, yes, I approve this connection. And then I'm all the way back on that other service again, and it does everything it needs to. And you can see there that it actually installed the plugin via the WordPress REST API plugins endpoint, which is pretty neat. This is an example of what this could look like on the desktop. So this is a plugin that I created called WP Mail Debugger, and I created a desktop application for it. And you can see there, I typed in my website, I got taken over to my website to approve it, and then the desktop application launched, and you can see I'm storing the password in the keychain, so I need to authenticate. And that's the entire setup process, and that's all I needed to do, which is, I think, really, really cool. Lastly, what I want to show you is the very short demo that the sample code for this talk will be posted online for. And so this is just a simple WordPress plugin that connects to another WordPress instance. I typed in the website that I wanted to connect to. I got taken to the authentication point, And then you can see here, I'm just making a simple authenticated API request. And then if I want, I can disconnect. And so all that code there is just like, I think it's less than 200 lines of code. I'll have a link to at the end of the talk that you can check out. So what is the availability for this feature? It was introduced in WordPress 5.6. It is enabled by default, but out of the box, SSL is required. So if you're not using SSL, you might run into a couple of different things, and there are ways to go about fixing that that I'll touch on a bit later. So what is the authorization flow? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to collect their site URL, and they can type in just their website. They don't need to type in like the URL to WP admin or WP login, just the URL of their website. Then we use a mechanism called discovery to look up the REST API. We look up the index to make sure that authentication is available. We redirect to a URL that is specified there. We receive the user when they're redirected back to our client or back to our application. We store their credentials, and then we make authenticated API requests. So taking a look deeper, that first step there is the REST API discovery process. This is a link to the discovery process in detail. And there's also a link, all the slides of this I'm going to post online, so you can click all these links. You don't need to feel to have to copy them down with any speed. And then there's also this composer library that you can use to handle the discovery process. But it boils down to three basic ways. There is the link header, which is the preferred way. And if you look at the response, when you make a request to that website, you'll see a link header that includes a relation that says api.w.org, and that's how you identify it. And then you can see there that is the base URL of the REST API. There's also another form that uses a link HTML element in the actual head of the document. And that is another possibility. It looks a little bit like this. There is one other thing to keep in mind, though. These work great for non-browser-based clients or applications, but you will run into a problem with this if you are trying to build this in a JavaScript application. One of the things that you'll probably run into is you'll get a CORS error that will prevent you from reading the response. And the REST API allows CORS requests for everything, but the problem is that the REST API only does that for the REST API. So if you don't know what the REST API is yet, you're kind of in a catch-22 there. If you just make a request to the home page, you won't be able to get that information because WordPress can't safely make that resource available over CORS. So what you can do instead is you can kind of hit the ugly permalink version. And this isn't guaranteed to work in 100% of cases, but in most cases it should, where essentially you'll just take the URL that they enter and you append index.php !rest_route =/. And that should serve you the REST API, and then you'll be able to get the prettier version of that URL. Next, it's time to look up the index. So we have the root URL of the REST API. And we'll just make a request to that endpoint. And from there, we can grab the site name or other details if we want to. And then we have to look up the authentication application password scenario or area to make sure that they have application passwords enabled for their site. And so when you look up the index, you get a response that looks somewhat like this. And you can take a look at the authentication application password section. And you'll see there that authorization endpoint, which brings them to the authorization UI. Before you make that request, you're going to need a couple of different things. The first thing that is not technically a requirement, but I would highly recommend, is an application ID. And this is basically an ID that is unique to your application and lets other people know what application this is. The way I would recommend creating your app ID is by using uuidtools.com and using the v5 version of UUID, and then using either the domain, the DNS namespace, or the URL namespace. And so that would look something like this. So for my application, you can see here I selected the domain name, and this is the domain name of my plugin. If I wanted to have, like, for instance, timothybjacobs.com/WP mail debugger instead, I would have chosen the namespace of the URL and just put that in there. And then you can just grab that UUID. And that's a constant string that stays the same. You can publish it. You probably should publish it. And you'll use that when making your request. The other thing you'll provide is the app name. And so this is the name of your application. It's what's shown to users when they're authorizing your application. And users can change this. They can make it whatever they want. One thing I would keep in mind here is if you're doing something like with a desktop device or an iOS device or a phone device, something like that, you should probably try and include the name of that device in the application name as well, so that if you're using your application across multiple different devices, each device shows as a separate application password and has its own name. Then the app ID that I talked about. Then a success URL, and this is where the user is redirected to after they approve the connection. And then optionally, you can provide a reject URL, and this is where the user will be redirected to if they reject approving your connection. If you don't include this, they'll be redirected to the success URL with success equals false in the URL. So it's not strictly necessary, but if you need to for how your application is architected, you can do that. And so this is what that process kind of looks like. Broken down. If the user isn't logged in, they'll first be brought to their login screen. And you can see there's a specific message at the top that's saying, please log into your site to authorize, and then your application name to connect to your account. They can enter in the username and password. And then they get to this authorized application screen. They can change the name there if they want to. They can click yes, I approve. And if they do, they'll be redirected to that URL that's there. So how do we go about handling this redirect? The first thing is very important. If you've done plugin development before, you've probably heard about nonces and CSRF issues. This, like any other action that your user could take in your plugin or your application, it's possible to be exploited with a cross-site request forgery. And you can kind of imagine a scenario in which this could go bad. Let's say your WordPress plugin or your application is meant to send information out of their WordPress website into someone else's WordPress website, into the WordPress website that they connect to. If someone clicks the link, that automatically authorizes their application to an attacker's URL, and then your plugin starts sending all of their sensitive blog posts or sensitive user contents or WooCommerce orders or something like that over to that URL. That's a big problem. So the same way that you would do for any other action in WordPress or really any other web application, make sure that you're using a nonce to protect yourself. And this is included in the example code of how you do this. When you get the redirect back, you'll get a couple of bits of information. You'll get the site URL, which is the connected website's site URL. The user login, which is the username of the user and what you'll use as part of the basic auth credentials, and the password, which is the application password that was generated. And so for our demo application, that looks something like this. We get redirected back to our admin page, which is the app passwords demo, where we've set a couple of bits in the URL so that we can identify it, the apd-callback and the state parameter, which is the nonce. And you can see the site URL is there, the user login is there, and the password will be there. Something you might notice if you take a close look at the password that you get back is that you'll see it's kind of chunked up in like this, where you have 4 characters of space, 4 characters of space, 4 characters of space, etc. The reason it's written this way is to make it easy for users who do have to manually type this in, to make it easier for them to keep track of what they're doing. But when you store this, you can remove the spaces, you can keep the spaces, it doesn't matter. Now, how do we go about storing the credentials that we just got? It's really important to note that app passwords themselves have the same permissions as the user. So if you're connecting to an admin user, you now have admin access to their website. You can only do things through the REST API, but that's still really broad permission. So you need to make sure to store this securely and take care of it properly. If you're just building a generic PHP application, I'd recommend using the diffuse/PHP encryption library. If you're like pretty much every language has secure encryption libraries, I think all of them do. I'm going to give a small example of how you do this in WordPress. In WordPress since 5.2, there's a library called Sodium Compat. And what this does is provide a simple to use as a developer encryption library, and it's available for all WordPress websites since 5.2. There are other ways that you can do this with WordPress and PHP. One of them being OpenSSL, but things like OpenSSL aren't a guarantee to be installed on people's websites, which is why I recommend using the Sodium Compat library, and it's a lot simpler to use. And so an example of this looks somewhat like this. We have our function called store credentials, which takes the user ID we want to save this to, the API root, which is that URL that we got from discovery, their username and their password. And then we get a secret key, which we would store somewhere like WP config. We generate a nonce, and then we encrypt their password. And then we can store it in user meta at that point. And so now if someone compromises the WordPress database, their password won't be leaked. It'll be an encrypted form that no one can do anything with. They need that secret key to be able to decode it. And then when we want to get credentials, we basically just reverse that process. And again, more documented form of this is available at the end of the talk. I'll send a link to the gist. And then we're pretty much done. We can now make authenticated API requests. Like I mentioned at the beginning, basic authentication is what is used. And so in PHP, it takes to form something like this, where we have basic, and then we base64 encode the username followed by the password. And in JavaScript, it's pretty similar. It's exactly similar, just different API calls, different function calls. So there are a couple of different things that I would recommend keeping in mind if you're developing an application and using application passwords. The big one is you really should make sure that you allow the user to use non-interactive authentication. It's possible that the authorized application endpoint will be disabled, it won't be allowed, they might not feel comfortable with it, things like that. And so one of the things that the feature provides in WordPress is that they can go to their profile page and generate a new application password. You should make sure that users are able to connect to your application by pasting that in manually instead of using the authorized application flow. You should really give people a way to edit credentials. So if they accidentally revoke the credentials or they want to change them for some reason, you should provide a way for them to manually update the application password. Keep in mind that it may be disabled for users. So you should probably have a help article information available. If it is disabled for users, when they get redirected to the authorized application endpoint, they'll be shown a message saying that application passwords is disabled for them. So that's just something to keep in mind, that just because it's available in the REST API index, it isn't available necessarily for every single user. You should handle revocation. So this is a big part of how app passwords work, is that a user can revoke the app password at any time. And so whenever you make an API request, you should do error handling, and you should specifically check for the incorrect password error code. And if you get that, it's a pretty good sign that your application password was revoked by the user. And at that point, you have to decide what to do, whether you prompt them to connect again, show an error, things like that. You should also think about the uninstall process. So when your app is uninstalled, you should, in most cases, clean up after yourself. So delete that app password when you're done with it. And you can do that by making a request to the application passwords REST API endpoint. So a couple of examples of that here. So you can see in my WP Mail debugger application, if they want to, they have a more manual form where they can enter in their website, enter in their username, and enter in their application password. And then also providing an interface for them to edit their credentials. And lastly, I'm going to go over a couple of gotchas that you might run into. You might run into this error message when you're testing. The authorized application request is not allowed. The success URL must be served over a secure connection, and the rejection URL must be served over a secure connection. So basically what's happening there is WordPress, for security reasons, requires that the HTTPS is used for that success URL and the reject URL. When you're prototyping, though, and you might be developing locally, you might not be able to make your local application server run over HTTPS. And in that case, you can use this code snippet on the site that you're testing against to remove that error. You also might just get a generic message that says application passwords are not available. And so again, like I mentioned, application passwords require HTTPS by default. Again, if you're developing locally and you're not able to set up HTTPS for your development site, you can add this WP environment type and set it to local in your WP config file. And that will override the HTTPS error in those cases. Another one that you might see is you might, if you're doing a JavaScript-based application, you might run into a scenario where you're passing the application password, but you're still getting a 401 unauthorized error. And this can be really confusing, but what's probably going on is that if that user is logged in, since the WordPress REST API is set up for cores, it will send that cookie along and the user will appear to be authenticated to WordPress. But because you're then not passing a nonce, which is what's required to do that cookie authentication, the authorization will be rejected, and you'll just get that 401 error. And so if you are going to be doing this in a JavaScript environment, you should make sure that you set the credentials mode to omit so that the application password itself is what's used. Lastly, you might get this error. Your website appears to use basic authentication, which is not currently compatible with application passwords. So like I mentioned, application passwords uses basic authentication under the hood. And so what this means is if your host, let's say, provides a staging mode or a protected mode or a password protected mode, oftentimes these are implemented as basic authentication too, and those two conflict with each other. And so if you run into that issue, there are a couple of things that you can do about it. If you look at this link here, this is linked to a WordPress track ticket in 5.6.1, which should be coming up in the next few weeks or so. There'll be a filter that you can use to override that error message if you want to. But generally, you should treat it as not compatible. They're just kind of inherently can't work together at the same time. So lastly, I want to touch on the roadmap. For WordPress 5.7, there are two main things planned at the moment. One is an introspection endpoint to allow you to gain information about the app password that you're using. If you remember when I talked about cleaning up after yourself, right now doing that is actually a little bit complicated. But when introspection lands, it'll be really, really easy to figure out what application password you're actually using and then to delete it. Also, right now, any user, the capability that is used for application passwords is the edit user capability, which is pretty broad. What we intend to do in WordPress 5.7 is to introduce really fine-grained capabilities. So for things like managing, listing, deleting, creating, those will all be separate capabilities, which should give you, if you have a custom setup on the WordPress side of things, you should be able to really customize how application passwords work for your users. And lastly, in WordPress 5.8, the big hope is to introduce capability scoping. So if you remember, I talked about how if you're connecting to an admin user, that application password can do anything that admin can do. What we really want to do is to let people say, okay, I actually only really need to create and edit and delete WordPress posts. I don't need the ability to install plugins and manage users. So what our hope is in WordPress 5.8 to introduce support for plugins, or excuse me, for applications to say, okay, these are the only permissions I need. And for users to be able to see that information and potentially even say, okay, no, I'll give you permission to manage posts, but I'm not going to give you permission to do this. But yeah, it's a really, really complicated thing to do. But it's my hope that we'll be able to do in WordPress 5.8. And so lastly, a couple of resources. The Application Passwords Integration Guide, which was published back when WordPress 5.6 was released, kind of goes into detail about this. And then also there is that gist that I talked about, which is the like 150 or so lines of a simple WordPress plugin to connect to sites using application passwords. I'm going to be making the slides available to this on my website, which is just myname.com, timothyjacobs.com. I'll be making that available in a couple of hours, or probably just right after this, actually, now that I think about it. But yeah, that's application passwords in WordPress 5.6.
Wow, that was unbelievably thorough. Thank you, Tim. All right, Victor has a comment and a question. His comment is that you are the greatest of all time, which I don't think anyone disagree with after that presentation. But his question is, does that mean that JSON Web Tokens are not? Wait, does this mean that JSON Web Token is 100% unnecessary?
I would say that there aren't a lot of reasons at the moment that I would recommend to still use the old JWT REST API authentication plugin. I would say 95% of use cases can be solved with app passwords at this point.
Great. Any other questions for Tim? Anyone? I mean, Tim, that was incredible. That was seriously thorough. I learned so much, and I can't wait to check out that gist. Any other questions going on?
I'll make sure to post on meetup.com too.
Great, thanks. Chris is asking if this is production ready. I'm guessing it is because it's in 5.6, but could you give us a little background for it?
Yeah, it launched in WordPress 5.6. This was based off of the feature plugin, which was developed like way back 4.7, 4.8. So it's kind of been in that feature plugin, which was in production use for many, many years. And then we moved it over into WordPress core officially with 5.6. So it is, I would definitely say production ready. I'm using it in my plugin. We're using it at iThemes for iThemes Sync for making that connection flow more robust. I believe the WordPress mobile team is working on integrating it at the moment. And I know there are a number of people who, I think the application passwords plugin had like more than 10,000 installs, I believe, active installs. And I know there are people already who have moved to the solution in WordPress 5.6 from the application passwords plugin. So I'd say it's definitely production ready. But there are more features and things coming in 5.7 and 5.8 and beyond.
Awesome. Good to know that iThemes is using this and with production with premium plugins. Cool. Yep. All right. I think that's it. That was awesome, Tim. Really,
awesome.
Really awesome. Thank you so much.